Okay, now the honor of introducing our speaker, Mr. Blair Horner. I had heard him briefly on previous occasions and was able to have a discussion regarding climate issues in preparation for this program. I came away re-inspired to advocate for ways to protect our environment and our planet, and I know you'll have the same reaction. I'm sorry, I can't talk very well, but since September of 2015, Horner has been executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG. Except for a brief period with other organizations, he has been employed almost exclusively with NYPIRG. Much of that time was spent as the legislative director. From 2007 through early 2008, he was a special advisor on policy and public integrity to the New York State Attorney General. In his over 30 years of work with NYPIRG, he has overseen community organizing activities and directed statewide issue campaigns. He has lobbied on a wide range of issues and written scores of reports examining issues including environmental protection, redistricting, campaign finance, political ethics, bank fees, auto insurance, healthcare, tobacco use, lead poisoning, and higher education funding. Horner's comments have been widely reported by the media. He's been interviewed on the Today Show, World News Tonight, Al Jazeera America, on A&E's investigative reports, and profiled in the New York Times. All right, now I'll let him talk. Without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Blair.
Well, thank you. When Joanna was introducing me, which was, by the way, was very nice, and of course, from notes from me, because not everybody knows what I've been doing, but it dawned on me it's now over 40 years, and that's sort of shocking to actually say those words and to think about it mathematically. So I have the thank you all for inviting me. The League of Women Voters is my favorite group because you guys are always, you spend time actually trying to make our democracy work better. And what we need is 330 million of you in order to make our democracy work better than it does. I love working with people who spend their time trying to make things better, and particularly those who volunteer their time to make it better. So the League is always, one of the groups closest to my heart. I mean, NYPIRG is pretty close to it because it pays me. But in terms of working with you guys, I think the League's been great all the years that I've worked, and I try as much as possible to be as helpful as I can. So my presentation today, I didn't know how much I should go over sort of in the sort of setting it up. So I'm going to touch on some things in the very beginning of where the science is at. When it comes to climate change, it's now become, as you all know, not a battle over science. It's really become a battle over culture. And this, climate science often gets described as sort of this radical thing. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit and then sort of seg my way through the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, and then into some of the current fights. I have to admit, it'll be I think depressing sort of presentation because as of today, nothing in climate is going to happen in the budget, which is sort of a surprise to me and sort of pathetic on the part of the governor and the legislature. But I'll get to that. I don't want to, give you the punchline to the joke before I even say it. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work out, but we do have plans B and C if I fail in terms of being able to see. You don't have to look at my, rapidly aging face while we're doing the presentation. Instead, you'll be able to look at a PowerPoint, which will be far preferable. So I'm going to do that now. And without a drum roll, let's see if I can do this without making a mistake. Hold on. There it is. Share. All right. Can everybody, let me just make sure I'm doing this right here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. We got thumbs up from Nancy. I'm in good shape. All right, so the theory is that I'll just hit the space bar and things will move along. The downside, as you all know on Zoom, is you can't really see everybody when you're doing a Zoom presentation. So I don't know, Nancy, you and I don't think we spoke about this, but if people could have any questions that immediately pop up, they can drop it in the chat, and maybe you could sort of, turn on the electrical shock that makes me pay attention. I will go through this, but there's definitely going to be time at the end for questions. So I wouldn't fret if you can't remember the question or you can't figure out the chat function. We'll come back to that no matter what. So this is, I'm going to start with the science because what New York State's policy is based on science. And the science is that climate change is real. The planet is heating up. You can see the chart in front of you. I don't have to read it. There is the climate scientists of the world all agree that it is, a function of human activity, primarily burning the fossil fuels. But as you can see, the planet's heating up. We all know it. We live in upstate New York. And we've noticed that, over the last 30 years, there's a hell of a lot less snow than there used to be. And we all remember horribly the air quality from the Canadian wildfires last year, which is a function of a rapidly heating planet, but not the only reason why it happened. But still, it contributes. So the science is the planet is heating up. These are various scenarios. Again, you will have access to the PowerPoint when I'm done. But you can, as you can see, depending on how much warmer the planet gets, you have a drier planet, a hotter planet. Oddly enough, you can also have more intense storms, meaning more precipitation. It just comes in gigantic buckets fulls as compared to spread out like it used to. And you can see the more intense storms. And as the planet heats up, the situation gets worse. And what you see there is in Celsius. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Celsius that much, Fahrenheit is a function of this number. But effectively, as you can see, the planet is already well over a degree warmer Celsius than it was at the beginning of the industrial age. The various scenarios you see to the right of that column are what can happen over the next few decades. The Paris Agreement, which you've heard, I'm sure heard about in 2015, was an effort by the planet to keep to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius planet heat increase. And so even then, it's not so great, but it will sort of keep us from having sort of catastrophic consequences for the planet and the humans and species that live here. This chart gives you a sense of, the increase in carbon dioxide emissions over time by category. And the worst part about it, in my mind, other than the fact that it sort of goes up in a scary way, is where you see the dotted line that says Paris Agreement. As I just mentioned, there was an effort to curtail carbon dioxide emissions. And as you can see, the emissions have gone up since then. So the Paris Agreement, it may have slowed down the parade, but the parade is still advancing. Just, in case you didn't know this already, of course, last year was the hottest year for the planet in recorded history. And as you can see on the bottom, sort of the trend bounces up and down. There's no guarantee that 2024 will be warmer than 2023, but the trend over time is warmer and warmer. And so that's what the science tells you. And so the experts say the way to keep to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius increase is to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Don't keep extracting it. Doesn't necessarily mean we all have to move the candles and horses right away, but you have to stop pulling more of it out of the ground to burn, to power our economy. And if you do that, of course, that means you have to do things to replace the power that fossil fuel currently generates. But the experts tell you, keep it in the ground, don't keep extracting, don't keep exploiting. So this is, again, a sort of a graph that talks about what you can do, what has to happen over time in order to meet what the experts say is the goal by the middle of the century, which is a net zero carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2050, just now, only like 26 years from now. These are the kinds of things that have to happen. Buildings have to be retrofitted. Cars have to rely on a different source of power. You have to reduce and eventually eliminate the use of fossil fuel to power a society. And you have to transition from a fossil fuel powered economy to one that relies on non-fossil fuel power in order to, of course, keep our civilizations afloat, but to curtail and to forestall the worst of what will happen under climate change. And I've talked about some of that before in the previous slides. Now, some of this may come as a surprise to us. I mean, you guys are all well educated on climate science. And so the slides I went through to you did not come, I'm sure, as a shock. But the oil companies have been researching this for decades. And this is, the headline of a New York Times article, been well reported, that Exxon knew in the 1970s that the burning of fossil fuels would lead to, an existential threat to civilization as we knew it. And they gauged it out, they gamed it out with great precision. Their scientists' estimates of what would happen if nothing happened turns out to be absolutely true, and we're living with it now. And there is even evidence that it goes back further. This article talks about Chevron in particular had known about the dangers in 1954. In fact, there were scientists, of course, that knew about this at the turn of the previous century. But in terms of the industry knowing about it, it seems to be well documented that in the second half of the 20th century, the companies knew. Now, in a normal functioning, rational, moral person, if you knew that something terrible was about to happen to all of the people that you loved and all of the people on the planet, a normal, well-adjusted human being would alert people to that problem, that threat. But we now know, again, that the industry decided in fact not to tell us the truth and to lie to people and to deceive them about the danger and to pay for front groups to advocate on their behalf, to block necessary reforms that could have minimized the damage that we're facing now, and they continue to do it. So that's sort of the history on this stuff. So in the year 2019, New York State, based on the science, passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I'll just call it the Climate Act in 2019. And these are some of the broad goals that it established in law. And it essentially means that we'll be at net zero by the middle of the century in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, our state. And when you think about what happens in the country with regard to environmental issues generally, if states like New York are not in the lead, it doesn't happen. It's rare that the Congress actually is the first place to act on these issues. And so New York has one of the most aggressive laws in terms of setting goals. And it created a group of stakeholders to then fashion out the plan, right? So you have these broad goals in the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act. And then there's a group of people that meet. And this slide talks about what they did to develop the plan that it was then sent to the public, the governor and the public at the end of 2022. It's called the scoping plan, which lays out the blueprint for how the state should meet the goals that are set in law from the 2019 law. So science-based analysis leads to legislation in 2019, which develops a group of people, of stakeholders, labor, environmentalists, businesses, et cetera, to figure out what's the blueprint for how the state should do it. And they do all of that. So it's from 2019 to 2022, they work on developing the scoping plan. And so the climate plan, I'm going to keep moving you back and forth here so I can read my own slides. One of the things that they talk about is developing a sort of a fund for sort of a resilient infrastructure, as we all know from more intense storms, rising sea levels, heat, et cetera. That's going to have an impact on sort of the physical infrastructure of the state. You're going to need to replace bridges that get washed out. You're going to have to figure out ways to curtail the damage from rising sea levels. You're going to have air conditioning in schools. There's a lot of things that you have to do to sort of adapt to the changing climate at the same time as you're transitioning from a fossil fuel-based powered economy to something other than that, right? So there's two parts to sort of the scoping plan. One is the steps to get you to a greener economy, and another is the call for a fund to be put in place in order to deal with the damages that a rapidly heating planet is going to inevitably cause. I mean, we all know if we stop greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, which won't happen, the planet will still be hotter. It's not like it just stops. So there are going to be costs related to that. In terms of the green side of it, the CLCPA has these various goals, which again, you can read, I won't, which essentially means that, phasing in, meeting certain deadlines, so that by the time the middle of the century rolls around, we're relying on power that comes from something other than fossil fuel power. And as you can see already, we generate a lot of non-fossil power from hydroelectric plants and nuclear power plants. The nuclear power plants are really, really old. They're designed and built by and large, 3 out of the 4 during the Vietnam War. For those of you who might remember that, that's how old these things are. But they are not fossil fuel powered, however you feel about it. And so there's already, we're sort of chugging along in terms of meeting the goals that have been set, although there is some concern about that. But I'll come back to that in a second. There is also specific language in the law and in the scoping plan that talks about that you have to target some of the money to disadvantaged communities in particular, because they already have inadequate infrastructure. They already have public health risks. They already have inadequate access to healthcare, to make sure that the costs that they bear is picked up by whatever systems are put in place as required in the scoping plan. Now, this article is new, relatively new, and it basically states, and you could look it up, but I'll just read and tell you what it means, is that despite these aggressive goals and the scoping plan that was put out in 2022, we're not on a pace to meet them. And that's what this article is really talking about. And I think it's broadly viewed that that's the case, that the state has not put in place all of the aggressiveness that it needs to meet those goals. And we can talk about why. But in some areas, the state is slipping. Some areas, the state is doing better. As I mentioned before, we already have these hydro plants from middle of last century, and we have these nuke plants from middle of last century that are already providing a lot of power that's non-fossil fuel. But there's a lot of stuff that still has to be done, and we're not really meeting those goals. So localities have begun to act. New York City has passed a bill that reduces, it's Local Law 97, which basically reduces the emissions in buildings in that city. And here it goes through the details as to what that looks like. That's passed a few years ago. They've also, and this is more detail on what New York City has done, the Local Law 97. It covers different size buildings different ways, but it basically phases in a system where the buildings that are constructed are done in such a way that they'll rely on electricity instead of fossil fuels to be powered, and that these are the sort of the criteria for that. Smaller buildings go in earlier than later buildings. There's also Local Law 154 that also deals with existing buildings. So New York City has tried to be sort of ahead of the curve. In New York City, where you don't really rely as much on cars, buildings are a big factor in terms of the city's greenhouse gas emissions, and they're basically very close to half of the state's population. And this is this is, as I mentioned, the local law 154. And both of these laws are designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions out of buildings. So New York State starts to act, and last year passes the All Electric Buildings Act, which mimics New York City's laws in terms of new construction, and has similar timetables, a little bit longer, but similar timetables in terms of new construction. You guys probably were involved in all of this stuff, so it may not come as a huge surprise. But it is, again, a reliance that as you construct new buildings, they're done in a way that minimizes greenhouse gas emissions and relies on electricity instead of particularly natural gas for power. There's also been legislation that was introduced that is, at the front burner in terms of climate agenda in Albany, something called the New York Heat Act, which is that has two major components to it. I mean, it's much more complicated than I'm going to describe, but two major components to it. One is that it basically says that new customers that ask for gas hookups that live within 100 feet of a main get that built at ratepayer expense. This New York Heat ends that, because why would you want to keep hooking people up to natural gas if you're trying to get off fossil fuels? And also it caps the amount of utility bills the customers would have to pay over time. So that's one of the issues in terms of dealing with reduction on a reliance on fossil fuels for ratepayers, and would save money. The governor in her budget introduced a version of that. It's not as sweeping as New York Heat, but it had similar, so it doesn't have, for example, the cap on utility rates, but it basically as well ends the 100-foot rule that I just described before. And so she puts that in her budget. So New York Heat is in the budget for the governor. Her version, they call the Affordable Gas Transition Act, and New York Heat is in the Senate's version. The Assembly has nothing when it comes to this issue in their budget proposals. So what happens? New York Heat gets blocked. The Assembly blocked it. As of today, as of now, it will not be in the final budget. Climate Superfund, which I'm going to talk about in a second, blocked at the governor's insistence, will not be in the budget. There's a proposal to end some of the tax benefits that fossil fuel companies get in the tax code, basically loopholes in the law, that would have generated some revenues for the state. The Senate had it in their proposal, blocked, will not be in the final budget. The apparent big winner in the budget, the fossil fuel lobby. Sort of ironic and horrible all at the same time that we live in a state where the fossil fuel industry can trump climate. We go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Climate Superfund because this is an issue I spend a lot of my time on, and I'm not trying to do this to goose you guys up to work harder on it or to do anything on it. It's just something I pay a lot of attention to because of the financial impacts, and it's a different environmental issue. As I mentioned before, there's going to be enormous costs to dealing with to the state's infrastructure, broadly defined, as a result of the warming planet and the more intense storms and rising sea levels and heat, et cetera, that I talked about before. This slide covers Comptroller DiNapoli's report, which came out last year, which says that over the current 10-year period, 5 years ago and 5 years going forward, this current decade, that more than half of all local governments' spending is going to be devoted to dealing with climate costs. So this is an impact on all localities all across the state. According to the comptroller, 55% of capital projects spent at the local level will be related to climate, either damages or resiliency projects to keep damage away. This is a report that was put out by the mayor of the city of New York, which found that just to upgrade this New York City sewer system to handle the more intense storms. So when the sewer system was designed 100 years ago in New York City, it anticipated storms that would be no more than roughly 1.5 inches of rain per hour. And now that's already going over 2 inches per hour. It's flooding the sewers. That's why you see those pictures of cars floating in the highways. The sewer system, just the sewer system, would be $100 billion to upgrade. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers says to protect New York Harbor alone from storm surges from rising sea levels is $52 billion a year. This report refers to a Long Island study done by the Long Island Regional Planning Council, which says to protect Long Island will be $75 to $100 billion. And so we have worked up a proposal, which I'm about to show you on a video. So you won't even have to listen to me for the next couple of minutes.
My name is Donna and I live on Long Island. I'm a teacher. In my classroom, we have a few basic rules. Be respectful of your classmates. Take responsibility for your actions. If you make a mess, make sure you clean it up. Seems basic, right? Well, right now we have a mess, much bigger and more costly than any mess in a classroom. And the corporations causing it aren't coming forward to clean it up. Who is cleaning it up? Well, I am. You are. In the past year alone, New Yorkers have paid $2 billion in climate costs. That's billion with a B. The cost is only going to go up. The cost of doing nothing could be up to $115 billion. Now for some good news. The money is there. Big oil companies have made $750 billion since 2021. Yes, trillion with a T. That's where the Climate Change Superfund Act comes in. It makes polluters pay. It holds the main driver of the climate crisis, big oil, responsible. It requires them to use a portion of their profits to repair and prepare for damages caused by the climate crisis. We already do this. Superfund laws that require companies to pay for environmental damage they've caused have been on the books since the 1980s. 89% of New Yorkers agree that it's time to make polluters pay their fair share. The Climate Change Superfund Act makes polluters pay to upgrade New York State's transit system. It makes polluters pay for improvements to our stormwater drainage and sewage systems. It makes polluters pay to improve our power grid. It's time to hold big oil responsible, and they will be, with first in the nation legislation to make polluters pay. Governor Hochul needs to protect New York taxpayers and make polluters pay.
All right, so let's see if I can go back now, if I have any more slides. I don't remember if I do, but let's see what we got here. We're back, right?
We're back.
Let's see if I can make this slide work, though, and I'm hitting the space bar, it's not moving. All right, let's try this.
Click on the screen and then you should be able to move forward.
There we go. So this is support for the act. You can, the Superfund Act, you can see there's a whole bunch of legislators and local officials in both houses on the bill. The Senate had it in its one house budget. As you can see, we have a majority of assembly members now that sponsor the bill, a lot of groups in support. Hochul's been the problem. And in the budget, it was the governor that stopped this proposal from being in the final budget. It's not a carbon tax. The one thing that you probably would be thinking about is, well, if the oil companies have to pay for it, does that just mean they'll pass it on to the public? The way it's designed, it shouldn't do that. We have a paper report put out by a bunch of economists that says it won't. They'll have to pay for it out of their profits. This basically talks about it here, but we can go into it in more detail later if you'd like. And this is the video again, just in case we missed it the first time. Maybe I should have used that one. In terms of additional information, this is additional resources in terms of the economic paper, as I mentioned, that argues that it won't be passed on to the public, and then some of the legal brief about the state having the authority to do it. And then what can we do? Now, when I drew up this PowerPoint, I didn't know what was going to happen in the budget. Unfortunately, nothing has. both New York Heat and Climate Superfund, which are the two big ones that we were dealing with in the budget process, both have been rejected in the budget. And so it's different analyses for both bills. New York Heat, the problem was the assembly. As I mentioned earlier, the governor had a sort of a weaker version of the New York Heat Act. And on the Superfund, it was the governor's office that killed the proposal. So both of those will be live when lawmakers return on May 6th. We get to do it all over again, but it won't be part of the budget. You just stop sharing here. I think that's the last slide. Oh, and if you want to know more, you get a chance to not only hear me, but the chairs of the relevant committee and the leaders, ranking minority leaders of the committees at the Albany Times Union Center in the middle of May. As you can see here, the speakers include the NCON chairs. So I assume the focus on the sneak peek into lawmaker will focus on environmental legislation, given who they are, but it may not be limited to that. And so if people are interested in attending that, you can sign up for it and it's free. Now I'm done. So let me stop here and go back. And Nancy, I think you were in charge of the chat. Was there anything that came up, or did you? And
Nope.
The one thing I warn you is, and if you don't have a lot of questions, I'm going to give long answers. If you have a lot of questions, I'll give short answers. It's up to you as to what you want to endure.
So we have a question from Linda. Linda, you want to unmute yourself?
So I just wondered about, like, what I've heard is that if I install solar panels on my home, or if I buy an electric car that takes, of course, a large battery, that fossil fuels are used to produce those things. So I'm in a conundrum over that.
Well, it's completely understandable. You know, the economy has not transformed yet from relying on fossil fuel power to make things to sort of an electric-based system that relies on green energy. So you're right that to make things, by and large, we still rely on fossil fuel power to make it. But, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So the idea is, to the extent that there are markets for non-fossil fuel powered things, houses, cars, buses, trucks, etc., that it'll become more ubiquitous to rely on electricity. And as in the case of New York State, and hopefully eventually the country, but certainly the world, has agreed that you have to reduce reliance on fossil fuels by the middle of the century, or else, you know, over time, the power that will be used to make things will be generated by non-fossil fuel powered manufacturing facilities. So, I mean, as consumers, you know, we're all going to make, you know, consumer choices for ourselves based on whatever our financial issues are and what we believe in. But this has to start somewhere. You know, electric cars are made by manufacturers, much of which that rely on power that comes from that fossil fuel power. But the only way to get electric cars is for us to go buy them. So that would be sort of my reaction to that.
Another question is, so who is paying to block the funds and enforcement in the New York State government? There has to be money going to parties or individuals.
Yeah, I mean, there has been, I mean, you guys already know this because you work with the League of Women Voters. There are organized interest groups that are funded by the fossil fuel industry, the American Petroleum Institute, for example, in New York, and the Business Council, which relies on the fossil fuel companies for their own operation. They are a powerful force, and they have friends in places you wouldn't necessarily expect. So there are, for example, unions. It depends on the issue. It's a little bit different depending on the issue. So, for example, in New York Heat, there are labor organizations that are opposed to the bill because they represent pipe fitters, and pipe fitters want to have pipes to fit. And if you're not relying on natural gas to hook up to people's houses, you're reducing the amount of jobs for them. Now, of course, there's an argument to be made. Well, you can make pipes for geothermal and you can do other things, but as a practical matter, they have a problem. So it is the usual stuff that you've all seen in other arenas. There are high-powered lobbyists and entities that spend a lot of money to block activity. They spent the propane lobby spent $1 million a couple of years ago to try to block all electric buildings because of propane, of course. There are allied groups, and then there's the sort of the partisan divide that funds the opposition to science-based public policy by calling it radical, by calling it unaffordable, by saying that no one has thought it through, that people are just making these things up. And that's why I showed you all those slides in the beginning. The one important thing that we all need to know, if assuming you agree with me, is that the public policy of the state of New York is based in science, and the development of the policies that are advancing what New York State is doing was done through this whole scoping plan process, a public process, with 32 individuals involved and agencies involved to try to develop the best issues. And now there's the fights in the legislative process. So it is it is the way public policy is supposed to be developed.
Crystal, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. I have read that the Federal Infrastructure Investment Act contains a lot of money to address the climate crisis. And I'm wondering if some of those funds are going to be directed towards New York State, and how do we take advantage of that?
Well, the short answer is yes. Money can only be appropriated through the state legislative process, the budget process. So the funds that are coming in from the feds to fund whatever the particular projects are that they want to fund through the IRA or other programs. For example, when I was talking about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and $52 billion for protecting New York Harbor, for example, 2/3 of that will be federal money. So there are all sorts of programs that are going to be coming into the state, and it gets directed by the feds, but it gets appropriated by the state legislature. So the money flows through the state legislative process. There are things that can benefit you individually in terms of your purchases of heat pumps or cars. There are funding mechanisms. There's something called the Energy Foundation, which provides sort of a dashboard for people to be able to look at where money gets spent in New York State. It's gazillions of dollars that are going to flow through the IRA to all across the country. And you're right, Crystal, what you have read is correct, that the money is going to be spent on very different kinds of projects. The Infrastructure Act is primarily about moving to a non-fossil fuel powered economy. So more electric charging stations for cars, for example, and there's a formula for how many miles you should have in between them. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's being invented to sort of prime the pump, excuse the pun, to increase the reliance on electric vehicles in particular, and also to invest in new ways to power things without relying on fossil fuels to do it. So what you've read is correct, and there are ways to sort of track it. This, again, as I mentioned, is something called the Energy Foundation, which has a dashboard, but it flows through by and large through state government.
Blair, we had someone speak from NYSERDA with this group, or not the same people, but in February. And I got the impression that they were one of the main agencies to use for those funds. Is that?
Yeah, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority is an authority. So it's not technically a state agency, but it's at the point of the spear for a lot of what New York is doing in terms of moving toward an economy powered on non-fossil fuel energy. So yes, yes is the answer. Sort of rambling response. Yes, I should have just said yes. That would have been simpler.
Okay, we have a question here. Is there a bill in the legislature mandating school buses transition to electric vehicles? And then,
yes.
And then impact on local school districts would be very large, question mark?
The short answer is yes, that there are, and it was in the budget. I don't know the status of that, what actually happened in the budget on that. There was the budget's not done, as some of you may know. The budget will probably be wrapping up sometime this weekend. I don't really know what's going on with the latest with electric, but both houses, and I believe the governor's office had it, they're relying, a lot of the reliance is on federal money through the IRA in terms of the purchasing. But the cost to the local school districts will be largely covered, at least in the initial part, through federal dough, assuming, the Congress doesn't change it. There are lots of costs. The buses are more expensive. You have to create charging stations. You have to have different kinds of mechanics. You have different kinds of insurance. So there are a lot of things that still have to be figured out, and they're going to be, the theory on this, I think, is that they'll be phased in terms of new purchases for school districts. But there's supposed to be a lot of federal money that's involved in this. So there will be an impact. There's no getting around it for all of us. But there are ways to mitigate the cost.
Okay. I don't know if anyone has any, I have a question. So you were talking about how we subsidize the oil, the coal companies and so on, but I guess they do not, we're not subsidizing green energy. What's the benefit of subsidizing? Why would they continue to subsidize the oil, fossil fuel industry?
Well, it's some of it comes from the way that state tax law is developed, which is basically it piggybacks on top of what the feds have. And so some of these are loopholes or tax expenditures in the state tax code that benefits, the mining of, fossil fuels, which, does happen in New York, but it's pretty much in the southwest corner of the state, west of Binghamton, south of Buffalo. But so that's not a big one. But when you get into some of the others, so for example, there's something called a petroleum business tax, which is a tax on, you can figure it out, right? Petroleum. So that's one tax that's used for, it's a tax on home heating oil, for example. And there are taxes on aviation fuel. And so those monies get used for other different kinds of things. But the companies benefit from it. So they get a tax exemption. So instead of paying taxes on aviation fuel, there's a tax on aviation fuel, but instead of paying it, they get a tax break. And so they get to benefit from that financially. Now, their argument on most of these kinds of issues, and there's probably around $1.5 billion of tax expenditures that are related to fossil fuels, that the argument is that most of these benefit the public because it costs less. So on home heating oil, instead of paying the tax, like if you were going to go out and buy shoes, you pay sales tax. You go out and buy home heating oil, you don't. And so that is a way to, if they were to eliminate it, the industry argues, it would just be passed on to the public. And so what was in the budget, at least the state Senate budget, was sort of a much smaller list of tax expenditures that they believe, the Senate believed, would not, it's about 10%, that would not be ones that would be affected by the public, and they didn't want to have the industry pay it. So but that didn't pass as part of the budget, as far as we know. Again, the budget's still open, so you never know until it's done. But what I've been told is the environmental table is closed. And so we don't expect that there will be anything on any of the items that I mentioned earlier.
Okay. Question here. Let's see. League of Women Voters Environmental Committee has heard that the Capital District Regional Planning Commission on how localities can implement the CLCPA. The issues are very complex to access the dollars. Many smaller municipalities may not have the capacity to actually provide the required assessments that will enable them to obtain the dollars. What to do?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. My normal knee-jerk reaction on this is the kind of thing that if people don't believe they are in that they have the capacity to handle whatever the program is, but in this case, CLCPA, that they have to get the relevant public officials involved to come explain it to them as why it works. Because the point of the CLCPA is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to follow the science. And if people don't know how to do it, then that's government's job is to fix that. Now, that could be an elected official, it could be NYSERDA, which is Nancy mentioned earlier, as an entity that could come and provide the technical assistance that's needed for localities to be able to meet the goals set in the CLCPA. But again, I'm more than happy to talk offline about that, because if it's a problem and it's not isolated, it's something that should be probably addressed through change in public policy.
Yeah. Going along with that, so so our environmental, you mentioned the Climate Act, and then New York State has a climate plan. So one of the things we were going to look into was, so for example, we represent Schenectady, Saratoga. We were going back to our counties to see what they were doing, and you know, most of the counties have climate plans, but the one thing we didn't see is how anyone's tracking this. I don't know if you have any information on that. I mean, so I went to a meeting and I asked how are they tracking their goals, and everything was just verbal. There was no written plan. I don't know if is that the norm, or do you know? I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, NYSERDA has a dashboard to track some of the state's efforts. I mean, we put out a report card, again, just on the state, not a local, about how many, what is the percentage of solar that we have now versus what we're expecting to have, and you know, what it should look like year after year. And they're really, and the scoping plan did talk about that there needs to be a mechanism. I firmly believe there needs to be a mechanism to hold public officials accountable on meeting these goals, because it's easy to say you want to do you want to meet these goals. It's hard to do them. And typically, the only way you can get things to move is if people feel accountable. And the absence of a real dashboard, I think, is a significant problem. You know, I showed you the slide before that there's been some media reports that the state is falling behind. And I think that's part of the reason, is that no one really understands what is supposed to be happening. They have a vague understanding that the state has this aggressive climate law, but no one really knows what it does. And you can't, it's not like a term paper. You can wait till the last night and write it and then crank it out and stay up all night drinking espresso to get it to your prof first thing in the morning. You have to tackle these issues, you know, on a sort of sustained annual basis, or you will fail. And if New York can't do it, who can in the United States? So to your point, Nancy, I mean, I think there should be, and I think it's a critically important thing. I think the comptroller should play an important role in this. We have argued for a separate entity, sort of like an independent budget office equivalent, whose only responsibility would be to pull together all of the available information and track how the state was doing. Now, of course, they don't want to do that because you know, it's the next guy's problem, because you're talking about the year 2050. So that, I know that was the depressing answer, but I do, other than NYSERDA's dashboard, I don't know of anything that's actually baked in to the system.
So I'm going to keep reading, but I do want to, you know, if anyone has a question and wants to just raise their hand or shout it out, go ahead. Nancy Peterson, you want to unmute?
Did I get it?
Oh,
Am I
now we
on
hear
here?
you.
Okay. I was wondering, the New York State Bond Act that was passed by the voters back in, I think, 2022, November 2022. Is there is that available for people to purchase bonds? Is that the way it works, or is it a bond act in that sense, or is there some other, how does that work?
Well, the Bond Act is a way, it's like a mortgage. The state will buy bonds and, you know, well, actually, the state will borrow $4.2 billion from Wall Street, essentially, by issuing bonds. Wall Street will buy them, and then the state will pay back twice as much. You know, like when you take out a mortgage, you buy it, and over 30 years, you pay it back, and you end up paying twice as much. It's basically what the Bond Act is, but it gives the state a lot of money early on, but it's the state that spends it. And so one of the
Okay.
governor's proposals, for example, in the budget, was to spend, I think it was $250 million to purchase properties that are endangered due to climate. You know, by and large, getting flooded is pretty much the types. So people's properties that are along, let's say, the south shore of Long Island. And because people won't be able to live there as the sea levels rise, the storms get more intense. And she said of that, I think it was 250 million, and I think it's in the budget, that she would use the Bond Act revenues to do that. So it's sort of like a way to do capital spending by borrowing the money. You get to kick the money out the door relatively quickly, but you have to pay it back. And there's no separate, like in the Climate Super Fund, the people who are paying it back are you and me and everybody else in New York. It's not like somebody else is paying that money back, basically the $9 billion that the state has to pay back for the bonds that they sell now. So it's not something for an individual unless the state created a program to do that. It's for the state to spend money on environmental costs, and it's not just climate.
Right, yeah.
Here's a
Thank
new
you.
question. Some communities are pushing back against solar farms. They feel they are ugly and taking up farmland. Do you have suggestions for helping communities accept solar farms?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the rock and the hard place, right? I mean, people are, I mean, some people find windmills aesthetically pleasing and some hate them. We live in a world of choices. The nuke plants that were built during the Vietnam War era, we don't see them, and if they ever blow up, God forbid, it's up in Oswego, right? So it's not something that we all sort of look at. Whereas solar and wind in particular, and geothermal to a lesser extent, are much more decentralized sources of power, and there needs a lot of them to make it work. So yeah, I mean, farmland becomes one of the places that people look at creating solar farms, because particularly if farms are, not being economically productive, the farmer wants to sell the land and put solar panels on it. They make money that way. So I don't know what that is, because we live those are tough choices. Those are choices between industrial version of solar and industrial version of wind, but we need it all in order to come up with the power necessary to keep our society functioning. If we're going to eliminate our reliance on natural gas and oil to power our economy. And so, I mean, that's why people in Nantucket hate looking out, and Montauk Point hate looking at windmills out in the ocean, and they want further away, is because of these sort of environmental aesthetics. But I don't think there's an easy solution to that. I really don't. Because again, it was mentioned earlier, how do these things get constructed? Well, they get constructed in plants. And how are they powered? Well, most of them are probably powered with fossil fuels, and they're toxic chemicals that are often used. And the manufacturing of, giant windmills comes with environmental costs. But we have to do something, because burning fossil fuels is killing us. And it's not a great choice. I would agree with that, but that is the choice. The power has to come from somewhere, and right now it's either fossil fuel or something that's not fossil fuel, and everything comes with its own environmental costs.
Yeah. In the short video, the suggestion was that the oil company's profit. Sorry, I just moved. That oil company profits can be required to pay for climate infrastructure. How could that work?
Well, here's the basic pitch on that. By the way, since we made the video, which was in early January, their profits have gone up. It's almost 900 billion now. Over the last 3 years, Saudi Aramco and the biggest Western companies cleared actually $870 billion in profits over that 3-year period, not revenues, profits. So how does it work? Well, the Climate Super Fund basically says that if you're a company that's responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases of 1 billion tons or more over the covered period of the bill, I can give you all the details, but I'll spare you the details for this part. you're in the program. You have to pay. It's like the regular Superfund. So GE has to pay for the cleanup of PCBs in the Hudson River because they put the PCBs in the Hudson River. So the big companies are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that go into the atmosphere that are causing this problem. So they're on the hook to clean it up. Same sort of concept. How does it not get passed on? Well, there are going to be plenty of companies that are not responsible for 1 billion tons of greenhouse gases. So for example, ExxonMobil definitely is responsible for 1 billion tons of, well, our analysis is that they would be in the program. Valero, which is another gas station that you guys may go to, is not. So if ExxonMobil wanted to raise its prices to cover the Climate Superfund Act in New York, they would be competing against Valero that does not. And so if they're going to raise their prices, they would do it at their own sort of market share peril. Because we all know how we drive. We go to the cheapest gas stations if we can. And if one's 25 cents more per gallon than another, I'm going to go to the cheaper one. So there's a sort of a marketplace pressure. And then in the companies that are in the program, they pay into the amount. It's $3 billion a year for each year for the next 25 years, these companies would pay. They pay on a sliding scale based on how much they're responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that occur. So even among the companies that are in the program, there's a difference in how much they would pay. There's also an economic theory that when you price any commodity, any kind of commodity, the price of the commodity is the current extraction, transportation, refining, distribution, and sale of that commodity. That's what makes up the price. And what they call an external costs, they could be anything, that are not attributable to what I just said, are considered sunken losses and are not reflected in the price. And an economist can make an argument to you, I'm not an economist, that that's what this would be considered, a sunken loss. But generally speaking, I think the free market argument is the one that makes the most sense to normal people, because if you raised your price, if you were ExxonMobil and you raised your price, let's say 25 cents a gallon, the other people that didn't would have a competitive advantage and you would lose market share. It's more complicated than that, but that's basically the reason why. And it's basically the reason why they would have to pay for it out of their profits. And we have economists that believe that, and all kind of stuff. So it's not just me.
Here's one going back to solar panels. Why don't we require all new buildings to be built with solar on roof or walls, new housing subdivisions? Are there any plans for like government buildings being required to put them
Yes,
on?
there are all different kinds of proposals floating around. And it's a very good question. I mean, there's a lot of state property. You got the college campuses all over the place. You have parks all over the place. You could certainly, there's sewage treatment plants all over the place. I mean, there's all sorts of public properties that could be a wonderful source for the placement of solar panels. And there have been proposals to deal with that. The All Electric Building Act, for example, doesn't say that, but it says that you can't use anything except electricity to power the new buildings. And so that creates an economic incentive if you're the builder to just put the solar panels on the top, although it doesn't require that. So I think that that's a great suggestion and one that I will look into more than what I just said. But we have worked on, proposals to sort of make it, to make the economics of it easier for businesses and residences to put solar panels on their homes. Like how do you change the rate system so that if you're generating power, it goes back into the grid, and if you need power, it comes back, but it's offset by the cost of whatever you generated from your home. It's called net metering, and we worked on legislation to do that. So there are programs in place to help people do, but you got to have the, we're in the Northeast, you got to have the right kind of roof. It's not just like everybody can do it. You have to sort of, particularly existing buildings and existing homes, you have to have a certain pitch to your roof for it to really work.
Right.
And you need to have, and then there's all sorts of insurance and, issues that relate to it.
Any last minute questions that people want to ask? Raise your hand or. So I don't know. Do you want to end with, are there any actions, any actions we should take, regulators we should contact or?
Well, this is an environmental group. And because of what I just told you about the budget, it means that the post-budget session in Albany there'll be a lot of environmental activity because not a lot on the environment got done in the budget. And the two bills that I mentioned, New York Heat and the Climate Superfund, will be two big ones, but there'll also be issues dealing with packaging and modernizing the bottle law. I mean, the state has a second crisis, which is related to the first crisis being climate crisis, solid waste crisis. According to the DEC, under the best of circumstances, the landfills that we currently have will be filled up and closed in 25 years. It could happen sooner, but 25 years. And that, you know, as we all know, can be a blink of an eye. Landfills and incinerators are responsible for 12% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. And so where is that all going to go if the landfills close? We're going to have to pay for it to be trucked out. And so there are proposals, packaging bill, for example, the bottle bill, for example, that are moving the state toward what's called a circular economy, where you design systems to encourage reuse, reduction, and recycling of waste. And that's going to be another issue that's going to have to be tackled. And really nothing happened on that of any consequence in the budget either. So there's going to be some big issues. I think if anything gets done in the area of climate and solid waste, they're going to be top issues starting on May 6th, when goes back into session after they wrap up the budget, which supposedly will be this weekend, but we'll see. And goes to the beginning of June is when they finish it up, because they want to head for the exits for their primary season. So there's really a very short period of time. Having a late budget gobbles up all of April for them to have sort of focused on non-budget issues. Some of the compassionate care issue you talked about earlier, for example, medical aid in dying. I mean, those issues get pushed out, and then there's like a whole traffic jam of those issues in a very short period of time. But I think these are going to be big issues. And so in terms of, again, the Nancy's specific question, I mean, we have to hammer the legislature as hard as we can to get them to move on these bills, because otherwise they won't. There's just too much traffic in the traffic jam. And to get these issues to move to the fore, they're going to have to hear from us loud, clear, and consistently between May 6th and basically Memorial Day, if we want to be poised to act on these incredibly important issues. It's not like the climate crisis is going away.
Right.
It's not like the solid waste crisis is going away. It's not like our democracy in New York is so perfect. It's not like our healthcare system covers everybody. There's lots and lots of important issues. And groups like the League, New Yorkers look to be the leaders in tackling these problems and doing the hard work that it takes to make our democracy work and to come up with good public policy. So I hope tonight helped with that. I will, of course, do whatever you guys want me to do. But you get your money's worth.
Yeah.
I'll do whatever you guys want me to do to be as helpful as I can in this issue or any of the others, myriad of issues that we work on together. So thank you again for your invitation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And we can end with, I did put in the chat, May 7th is the League of Women Voters Lobby Day. And May 14th is New York is Not Disposable Lobby Day. So,
I'll see you there.
okay. Thank you,
Yeah.
Blair. Okay. Good
Thank
night,
you,
everyone.
Blair.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
all.
everybody.
Good night.